Man simply can't choose his own day of worship. Does Romans 14 verses 5 allow us to make our own decision to keep any day as the set apart day? In this week's teaching, Paul is credited as providing a basis for the change of the Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday. Let us take a look at Romans 14 verses 5 in context. Shalom, welcome to Spirit and Truth. I'm your host, Shaun Cairns. Can a man choose his own day of worship? Today we'll be looking at the meaning behind Romans 14 verses 5. Does it allow us to make our own decision about which day to keep holy? In rejecting the observance of weekly Sabbath, a number of groups rely heavily upon Romans 14 as a proof text. Now, indeed, verse 5 certainly has the appearance of allowing each individual the liberty to choose whatever day he wishes to worship. One man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. You see, in this verse, really, it teaches that man may ignore the law and select any day he wishes in worship of Almighty Yahuwah. Then it runs counter to the other teachings of Paul in this same letter. Note that he quoted the 10th commandment. He forbids covetousness in Romans 7 verses 7. And in verse 12, Paul writes that the law is holy, the commandment holy and just and good. You see, Paul kept the law. Paul taught the law. In Romans 7 chapter 20 verses 22, Paul says that he delights in the law of Elohim after the inward man. Paul held the law in high regard and admits that he was taught according to the perfect manner of the law. In Acts chapter 22 verses 3, he further states, "This I confess unto you, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the Elohim of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets." Acts 24 verses 14, Paul followed the Bible's teachings, but rejected the burdensome and erroneous man-made teachings added by the scribes and the Pharisees. In Acts chapter 26 verses 22 and chapter 28 verses 23, it reveals that Paul continually relied upon and quoted the teachings of the Old Covenant for his authority. You see, Paul was not against keeping the Torah. So how do we explain these puzzling verses in Romans 14? Are we to understand that puny man can ignore the commandments and observe any worship day that suits him? You see, an important discipline we must practice to resolve enigmas such as this is to read the verse in question in its entire content. It's all about context, beloved. You see, reading all the pertinent verses before and after the passage to get a clear understanding of the meaning expressed. Now again, Paul says something remarkably, in Romans 14 verses 2, he says, "For one believes that he may eat all things, another who is weak eats herbs." You see, this introductory verse of chapter 14 of Romans zeroes in on the person who is weak in the faith. He is new to the word, just starting to assimilate Bible truth. Because much of the flesh of cattle and sheep available to them was dedicated to heathen deities, or was not drained of blood, some brethren were reluctant to eat flesh of any kind, but stuck to a diet of fruit, grain, nuts, and vegetables. But Paul clearly teaches that scripturally clean food was good and not to be rejected. For it is sanctified, it is set apart by the word of Yahuwah in Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. And pray by asking Yahuwah's blessings upon it, as we see in 1 Timothy chapter 4 verses 5. There is nothing wrong with eating meat, Paul writes, for Yahuwah devotes 2 chapters to defining the difference so that we eat the clean and avoid the unclean animal like scavengers and carnivorous beasts. In verse 3 of Romans 14, Paul touches on weekly fasting being a personal choice. You see, Paul is likely referring to those who do not eat at all, but who select a day in which to fast. Instead of fasting 1 day a week, the self-righteous Pharisees fasted 2 days a week, both Monday and Thursday, as we see in the account of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke chapter 18 verses 12. Now, whether we fast or not is up to the individual, says Paul. It is between Yahuwah and the person. If he is sincere and upright, Yahuwah will strengthen him and make him stand. Romans 14 chapter 4 says, "Who art thou that judgest against another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, though he shall be held up, for Yahweh is able to make him stand." As we move to verse 5, we see that Paul comes to the grips with this verse, in which he explains that some people prefer a certain day to fast and others deem any day suitable. Fasting and not worshipping. You see, Romans 14 verses 5 says, "One man esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind." What Paul is referring to here is not worship, but rather, my beloved brother and sister, as you're listening to me, but he's referring to fasting. Notice that not one word has been uttered about observing a day of worship. The Sabbath or first day of the week is not even mentioned. The next verse clearly provides that the subject Paul is addressing here, as I mentioned, is fasting, not worshipping on a certain day. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto Yahuwah, and he that regardeth not the day to Yahuwah, he does not regard it. And he that eats to the master, for he gives Elohim thanks. And he that eats not to the master, he eats not, and give Elohim thanks. Romans 14 verses 6. Now if one fasts on a certain day, he does so in reverence to Yahuwah. If he eats on that day, he then thanks Yahuwah for the food. He that fasts on that day gratefully thanks Yahuwah for drawing closer to his people. You see, the rest of the chapter goes on to show that we do not live or die to ourselves, but all that we do is noted by Yahuwah, as in Romans 14 verses 7. There is absolutely nothing in this 14th chapter dealing with the Sabbath, festivals, new moons, or Sabbath years. Paul did not do away with the weekly Shabbat or feast days. Rather, he observed them and taught us to keep them also. Paul is teaching us about being tolerant of other believers, especially the babe in the Word who has just begun to follow the steps of our Messiah, Yeshua. If someone brings up this verse in an effort to prove man esteems one day above another, and Paul did away with the Sabbath, remember, beloved, it simply means man prefers one day over another, not Yahuwah. And man can choose whatever day to fast that pleases him. The Savior said, "But the days will come when the bridegroom shall take away from them, and then shall they fast in those days." Luke chapter 5 verse 35. How clear Paul is telling us through his letter to the Romans that we can select any day we wish to fast except the weekly Shabbat. Now that the Savior Yeshua, the Messiah, the bridegroom, is taken from us, we are expected to fast. And finally, Paul adds that we are to not ridicule anyone who is vegetarian. Rather, his message is for us to follow after the things which make for peace and things wherewith one may edify another. Romans chapter 14 verses 19. Shalom to you, and I trust that this teaching has been a blessing. Please do go to our YouTube channel and listen to the full teaching of Romans chapter 14.
Thank you for listening to another inspiring Torah portion teaching by Shaun Cairns. Spirit and Truth is committed to re-establishing the faith once delivered to the saints without compromise, empowered and guided by the Ruach HaKodesh. If this teaching ministry is a blessing to you and your family, won't you consider partnering with us and help us take the word of Elohim to the ends of the earth? Find our bank details below to sow your partner seed today. Shalom.